The morning of the Duke of Ashmore's second wedding broke cold and clear over the village of Windley, the September light lying flat and pale across the churchyard yews, the stone tower throwing its shadow long over the gravel path. Carriages had been arriving since 9 o'clock. By half past the hour, the lane was lined with matched pairs and postilions in livery, and the sound of voices, the particular bright, carrying voices of the gentry preparing to witness a solemn occasion, drifting from the porch and out through the churchyard gate. She stood at the far edge of the graveyard, half behind the oldest yew, in a sage-green Empire waist gown and a cream Spencer jacket that had done hard service and showed it. She was slight and fine-boned, not quite 5 feet 3 inches, and she wore white gloves worn thin at the fingertips and a plain bonnet that kept her face in partial shadow. She had been standing there for nearly a quarter of an hour. She had not intended to weep, she had told herself. In the coach from Bath, and again in the small inn where she had passed the night, that she had come only to prevent a legal wrong, that what happened after was not her concern, that she had long since ceased to be anyone the Duke of Ashmore needed to consider. She had told herself these things with conviction, and she had been wrong about all of them. A woman near the church gate turned, an older widow in dark plum silk, and caught sight of her standing there beside the yews, with tears plainly on her face. The widow murmured something to her companion. Both looked. The woman in the sage-green gown did not move. She pressed her gloved fingers briefly to the corner of her left eye and returned her gaze to the church door, where the guests were still filing in, cheerful and unhurried, on a lovely September morning in the year 1817. She was, by law, the Duchess of Ashmore. She had been for 5 years, less 11 days. Nobody inside that church was prepared to believe it. If you have ever wondered what it costs a woman to return from the dead, keep listening. This story is for you. The accident had happened on the 4th of October, 1812, on a narrow road above Loch Rannoch, in the Scottish Highlands, in rain and failing light. The carriage had left the track. That was what they established afterward, the grooms who searched and the factor who filed the report. Left the track, overturned at the ravine's edge. The coachman had been found at dawn, injured and senseless. Of his passenger, Miss Cecily Hartwell, who had become the Duchess of Ashmore 2 years previous and was traveling north to visit her ailing great-aunt in Perthshire, there was no evidence. The carriage had gone over the edge. The loch was deep. She had not gone over the edge. She had been thrown clear before the carriage reached it, or she believed so, though the believing came slowly and in fragments over the course of months. She had lain in heather and mud for a night and most of a day, unconscious, with a wound at her left temple from a stone or a branch or some piece of the carriage she could never name. She had been found by a man named Alasdair MacRae, a crofter with a wife and 2 grown daughters, who carried her to his house on a door and put her before his fire and sent his youngest daughter to the nearest physician, who came 3 days later and said she was alive, but that the injury to her head was serious. She survived. That much was simple. What was less simple was the returning. The memory did not come back in a useful rush. It came in pieces, some true and some half-formed, and they arrived in no order the mind could make use of. She knew her name within a week. She knew she was English within a month. The particulars, the house in London, the Scottish journey, the reason for the journey, the name of her husband. Those assembled themselves slowly, like rooms of a house she was relearning from the outside, pressing her face to each dark window in turn. By the spring of 1813, she knew who she was. She knew she had a husband. She did not yet know what he had been told. The McCraes were good people in the particular way of people who have very little and share it without ceremony. They had kept her through the winter because there was nowhere else to send her, and she had paid for their kindness in the only currency available to her, which was labor. She could not write with any fineness. The penwork of a London drawing-room was beyond her for nearly a year. She could, however, card wool and keep a fire, and read aloud to the daughters in the evenings from the Bible and from the single novel the household possessed, a copy of a Scottish poem cycle bound in cloth, which she read so many times she could recite sections of it. She was not helpless. She had never been helpless. That was, she thought later, the wound the accident had failed to give her. By the summer of 1813, she had sent a letter to London. She had addressed it to the house on Portman Square. She received no reply. She sent a second letter. She received no reply. The third she addressed to Edmund Vane, the Duke of Ashmore, Ashmore Hall, Wiltshire, and after 3 months received a reply not from Edmund, but from a solicitor in Bath, one Mr. Calder, who wrote in formal terms to say that he was unable to pass along her correspondence to the Duke of Ashmore, as it would cause the Duke unnecessary and cruel distress, as the Duchess of Ashmore had been deceased for over a year, and her claims to the contrary, however sincerely expressed, were the result of either confusion or an attempt to profit from the Duke's grief. She had sat with that letter for 2 days. It was the McCrae girls, Ishbel and Moira, practical and plain-spoken as their father, who told her she ought to write again with evidence. She had the marriage lines. She had carried them in her traveling case, and the traveling case had come to rest against the crofters' wall when Alastair McCrae carried her home, and it had stayed there, and she had said nothing because she did not know yet what the case contained. Inside it, under a chemise and a half-finished letter to her great-aunt, was the marriage certificate, signed and witnessed. Inside it, too, was a small garnet brooch, deep red as a winter apple, that had been her mother's, that she had worn on her wedding day because her mother had worn it on hers, and that she had taken north with her because she had been reluctant to leave it in London in a house that was not yet quite her own. She wrote again. She sent the letter not to the solicitor, but to the solicitor's superior, a firm in London of some distinction, with a copy of the marriage lines and a careful accounting of her circumstances. She received a reply. The reply informed her that the Duke of Ashmore had opened proceedings to have the Duchess declared legally deceased, which proceedings were substantially advanced. He was, the letter said, in good health. He was in mourning. She had closed that letter and not opened the question again for 2 years. What had kept her in Scotland so long, if she knew who she was and had proof of it, was a question she had asked herself in the small hours of many nights. The true answer was simpler than she wished it to be. She had been afraid. Not of Edmund. Not precisely of what would happen if she presented herself at Ashmore Hall alive. She had been afraid of becoming again the person who had left London on that October morning, the person Edmund had been cold to in the days before her departure, a coldness over something small, something forgotten now, whether she should stay through Christmas or leave early, some question of household management she could not retrieve. He had been cool and clipped, and she had departed without his proper farewell, and those days had not yet begun to soften in her memory the way old griefs are supposed to soften. They were still sharp. The way he had not come to the front door, the way the footman had handed her into the carriage instead. She was a woman who had survived a great deal by being sensible about costs. She did not count the staying in Scotland as cowardice. She counted it as knowing that some returns are too expensive to attempt until you are certain you can bear the price. She had returned to England in the spring of 1816, to Bath, to her great-aunt's house. Her great-aunt had died the previous winter. The original journey's destination, reached at last and already past. The house had passed to a cousin who recognized her and was glad to see her and asked no uncomfortable questions. She had found work as a reader and correspondent for an elderly general who had poor eyesight and many opinions. She had lived quietly. She had listened for news. In August of 1817, she had learned from the Bath papers that Edmund Vane, the Duke of Ashmore, was to marry Lady Honoria Pemberton, daughter of Viscount Pemberton of Dorset, at the Church of St. Giles in Windley, Wiltshire, on the 14th day of September. She had sat with that news for one day. One day was all she allowed herself. Then she had gone to find Mr. Calder's successor in Bath, a solicitor named Prentice, who had been recommended to her by the General's own man of business, and she had laid before him the marriage lines, a sworn statement from Alasdair MacRae and his wife, a letter from the physician who had attended her in the winter of 1812, and her own written account of the past 5 years. Mr. Prentice had read these documents in silence, and then sat back in his chair, and said, in a voice of careful professional evenness, that the legal situation was clear and that the marriage had never been legally dissolved, as a declaration of death required 7 years to complete under English law, and that she was still, in the eyes of the law, the Duchess of Ashmore. She had known this. She had come to him because she needed a witness, and because she would not walk into that church alone. She had thought, driving north from Bath, that she was equal to whatever she would find. She had been wrong about that, too, because she had not accounted for the yews, or the September light, or the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, or the way the guests moved through the churchyard gate with the easy certainty of people who belonged to a world she had once belonged to, and which had gone on entirely without her. She pressed her gloved fingers to her temple and turned from the yew. If you are wondering what comes next, I think you already know. Whatever it costs her, she will walk through that gate. She has not survived 5 years to be unmade by a morning. Stay with this story, because the hardest part has not yet begun. She had asked Mr. Prentice to meet her at the church. He arrived with his clerk, precisely when he had promised. He was a small, composed man with the face of someone accustomed to bearing news that altered the shape of other people's lives, and he carried a leather satchel and said nothing that was not necessary. Together they entered the churchyard. She did not look at the guests still moving toward the porch. She looked at the stone and at the yews and at the pathway, and she put one foot before the other. Inside the church, it was cool and hushed. The nave full of pale morning light from the high windows and the smell of fresh flowers, white roses and hothouse lilies and cut greenery, and the murmur of nearly 200 guests settling into their pews. The organ was playing something quiet and ceremonial. Cecily stood at the back of the nave, near the baptismal font, and did not move. She saw Edmund before he saw her. He was standing at the chancel rail with his back to the congregation, his shoulders very square, one hand at his side, and one at the small of his back in the posture of a man who has decided to be still and is holding to that decision by an act of will. She knew that posture. She knew the particular set of those shoulders, the way the dark auburn hair lay against his neck. He had always been a man most visible in profile, most himself at a slight remove from the room. She had loved that about him long before she understood she loved anything about him at all. The Dowager Duchess of Ashmore was in the front pew on the right, seated very upright in black silk with silver trim, her white kid gloves folded in her lap, a pearl and diamond necklace at her throat. She wore her silver-white hair high with pearl combs. She had always looked as though she were seated at the head of some invisible table that the rest of the room had not been invited to share. It was Marian Vane who turned first. Some disturbance in the air at the back of the nave, or a guest who looked too long at the young woman by the font, caught her sharp blue eyes and drew them back. She saw Cecily. The fan at her wrist did not move. Her expression did not change. That was the most frightening thing, and Cecily had prepared herself for it, and still found it frightening. She leaned to the woman beside her, an elderly aunt with a hearing trumpet, and spoke behind her glove. "Do not look," she said, her voice low but entirely controlled. "There is a grief woman at the back. One of those poor creatures who attach themselves to houses of mourning. She will be removed." She did not look at Cecily again. She turned her face forward, toward the chancel, toward her son, and settled her gloves in her lap with a small, precise motion of finality. Cecily had heard. She was 10 feet away, and the nave was not so full of sound that she could not hear. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. The preparation did not prevent the impact of it, the cold, specific weight of being reduced, in the house where she had been a wife, to the category of a nuisance to be cleared. Mr. Prentice had heard too. He did not look at the dowager. He looked at Cecily and gave a small, grave nod. She had not come here to make a scene. She had come because a woman in white at the altar did not know she was about to enter a bigamous marriage, and because Cecily's own 5 years of careful endurance deserved at minimum a legal truth. The organ music changed. Lady Honoria Pemberton appeared at the west door. She was tall and fair, rosy-complexioned, composed in white with golden blonde hair, dressed high with white flowers, her lace veil flowing behind her. She was the correct choice in the way that some women are the correct choice, conscientious, gracious, entirely prepared. She paused in the doorway with her father's hand on her arm, and the assembled company turned toward her in a collective drawing in of breath, and the dean of the parish adjusted his vestments at the chancel, and Edmund turned. He turned because the congregation turned, because a groom is expected to look. He turned, and he looked down the length of the nave, past the white and the flowers, past the rising music, and somewhere in the movement of his gaze, in the transit from the west door to the chancel and back, he found the figure by the baptismal font. He stopped. Not the congregation's pause, not the held breath of ceremony. He stopped. His hand, which had been at the small of his back, dropped to his side. His face did not change in any visible way that the room could read, but Cecily had spent 2 years learning to read a face that did not change in visible ways, and she saw it. The particular quality of his stillness shifting from will to suspension, as though the machinery inside him had simply and completely stopped. He knew her. He knew her in the first second, before his mind had any useful thought to offer. His body knew her the way a man's body knows the specific quality of light in a room he grew up in, the way it recognizes what it had believed was gone and adjusts, without permission, to the fact that it was wrong. Lady Honoria had begun to move down the nave. The dean was waiting. The guests had settled, and the organ had swelled into the processional. And Edmund stood at the chancel rail with his eyes fixed not on his bride, but on a slight woman in a sage-green gown at the back of the church, and he did not move for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to the chancel. He faced forward. He was, after all, a duke, and he had been trained for 33 years in the particular discipline of not allowing what he felt to appear on his face, and he employed that discipline now, and he stood with his hands at his sides while Lady Honoria walked toward him, and the music played, and the dean smiled, and Cecily, at the back of the nave, closed her eyes and breathed. This is where it becomes difficult to tell. She had not come to disrupt. She had intended to wait until after the ceremony and present herself and her documents to the Duke's solicitor and allow the matter to be resolved through proper channels, quietly, in some room away from 200 witnesses. That had been the plan. That had been Mr. Prentice's plan, and he was a sensible man, and she trusted him. Then the dean opened his book and said the words that open a wedding service, and the moment that those words required came as it must. And the dean said, in his pleasant carrying voice, "If any person present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, let them speak now, or hereafter hold their peace." And the church went very quiet. Mr. Prentice looked at her. She had not planned to speak. She had planned to hold her peace and handle it afterward. She had told herself this was the right way, the dignified way, the way that cost everyone the least. "I do," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. 200 people in a stone-walled nave in complete silence is not a large space to cross. The dean looked up. Lady Honoria turned her head. He went still in a way that was entirely different from the disciplined stillness of a moment before. Cecily walked forward, down the center of the nave, past the pews and their occupants, and the trailing white flowers and the small turned faces, until she stood in the open space before the chancel rail, where the dean and the two of them were standing, and she said, in the same quiet voice, the voice she had used with the McCrae daughters, reading aloud in the evenings, the voice that had steadied through worse than this. "This marriage cannot proceed. I am the Duke of Ashmore's wife. I have been his wife for 5 years. I did not die." The silence in the church was absolute. Lady Honoria looked at her with an expression that was, more than anything, one of the most careful attention, as though she were being presented with information that required the full capacity of a composed and intelligent woman to process, and she was determined to give it that attention. He looked at Cecily. He looked at her for a long time. Not at her gown, or her bonnet, or the documents that Mr. Prentice was now moving forward to present. He looked at her face. The wide-set gray eyes, the small straight nose, the mouth with the pronounced upper bow, the faint scar at the left temple, half hidden by her hair, that had not been there when she left London in October of 1812. He did not speak. This was the moment she had feared. Not the interruption of the wedding, not the dean's expression, not the collective intake of breath from 200 guests. This. His silence. 5 years of careful preparation, and she had not found a way to prepare for this possibility, that he would look at her and simply not know what to do. The dowager rose from the front pew. She moved with her habitual unhurried authority, and she stood beside her son, and she said, in a voice calibrated, to carry precisely as far as she wished and no further, "Your Grace, I do not know what this woman imagines she has achieved by this intrusion. A grief woman walking into a church with forged documents and a fabricated story is not an impediment to a legal marriage. She is a scandal. She is a poor creature who has lost her reason and attached herself to a family's grief. Have her removed." Edmund did not move. "Your Grace," the dowager said again, a faint and precise edge entering her voice. "I said, have her removed." He was looking at the scar. He was looking at the left side of her face, at the faint line of the scar above her temple, and she watched him look at it. She watched the thing that happened inside his face when he looked at it. Not an expression exactly. A reorganization, like a hand of cards laid out again in a different order. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice was very low. She could not tell if anyone else had heard it. "A stone," she said. "Or a piece of the carriage. I was never certain." "The carriage," he repeated. "Yes." He looked at Mr. Prentice. He looked at the satchel. He looked back at her face, and she held the look steady, the way she had learned to hold a great many things steady over 5 years. And she said nothing more. The dowager's hand was on his arm. "Edmund, look at me. Edmund, this cannot be. Step back," he said. Not to Cecily, to his mother. Marion Vane stepped back. The silence in the church was a different quality of silence now. The 200 guests were still, utterly still, with the quality of stillness that belongs to people who are witnessing something that has not yet resolved and who know it. Edmund said very quietly, "Is your proof in order?" "It is," Mr. Prentice said. He had reached the chancel steps. He opened the satchel. Edmund did not look at the documents for long. He looked at the marriage certificate, at the signature that was his own, at the witnesses' names, at the date. He looked at the sworn statement from Alastair McRae. He looked at the physician's letter with its date of December 1812 and the careful clinical account of a woman's head wound and her survival of it. He closed the satchel with the same deliberate hand. And then he looked at her again, and this time she was not certain she could keep looking back. "Leave me," he said, to everyone, to the dean, and to Lady Honoria, and to the dowager, and to the assembled 200. He said it the way a man says a thing when he means it absolutely, and is not prepared to be argued with. "She is my wife. She has always been my wife." There was a movement at the chancel, a rustle and a shift of white silk. Lady Honoria took a step back, and then another, and she looked at Cecily with an expression that contained many things, not one of which was malice. And she said, in a low and perfectly controlled voice, "I believe that settles the matter." And she turned, and she walked out of the chancel. The dowager did not move. "Mother," Edmund said, "you cannot possibly believe this. I have asked you to leave." She left. The church did not empty quickly. 200 guests do not empty any space quickly when they are also trying to watch something. The dean was a practical man, however, and a kind one, and he spoke briefly and firmly. And the guests moved, slowly, with many backward looks, out through the side door and the west door, and eventually through the churchyard gate. And the voices in the lane outside were not the cheerful voices of guests arriving, but something altogether more alive. Cecily stood in the empty nave, and did not know, for a long moment, what to do with her hands. Edmund was still at the chancel rail. He said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "You sent letters." "3, she said. "The first 2 to the London house, the third to Ashmore Hall. All returned back. I did not see them." "No," she said. "I know." "Calder," he said. It was not a question. Yes. He turned then and came down the chancel steps, not quickly, not the 3 strides of a man in urgent motion, but the measured movement of a man carrying something very heavy and attempting not to let the carrying show, and he stopped at the foot of the steps with 3 feet of pale morning light between them. "I sold your portrait," he said. She had known this. She had heard it from a Bath acquaintance who had seen it at auction. She had felt it, when she heard it, as a specific small blow to the center of her chest. She felt it again now. "I could not look at it," he said. "I want you to understand that. I sold it because I could not look at it in the house, and I could not bear to put it away where I knew it was, and I have regretted it since the first week after the sale." "Edmund," she said. "I was cold to you," he said, "before you left. You know that I was cold to you, and I have not stopped knowing it for 5 years." Her throat was tight. She had not expected this. She had prepared for his shock, for his anger, even for some residual grief that had become attached to another woman in the years of her absence. She had not prepared for his accounting. "It was a small thing," she said. "The argument? It was a very small thing. You left without a proper farewell." "Yes." "And I allowed it," he said. "I was in the study, and I heard the carriage, and I thought, I will speak to her when she returns. I will say then what I should have said before she left." He stopped. He looked at her face, at the scar at her temple. There was nothing to return to. She could feel the tears again, the ones she had pressed away in the churchyard, and she did not press them away this time. She said, "I am here now?" He said, "Yes." He stood very still for another moment. Then he said, quietly, "I do not know how to proceed from this. I am not certain." He stopped. He pressed his hand briefly to his mouth, a gesture she had seen him make in very few moments of his life, and she recognized it as the gesture he made when the disciplined architecture of his composure was under genuine strain, and the recognition of it, after 5 years of absence, was almost more than she could hold. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "you might begin with my name." He looked at her for a long moment. "Cecily," he said. She had heard her name, obviously, every day of her life. From the McRaes and the Bath cousin and the General and Mr. Prentice and a dozen other people in 5 years. She had heard it in her own head many times more. She had not, until that moment, known how much she had been waiting to hear it in this voice, in this particular voice, the level and guarded voice that gave so little away and which, in the single syllable of her name, gave everything away. "Yes," she said, "that is where I would start." In the lane outside the church, among the carriages and the displaced guests and the footmen and the postilions trying to make sense of a morning that had not gone as planned, there was a great deal of conversation. The widow in dark plum silk, who had seen a young woman weeping at the yews, and mentioned it to her companion, had now become the inadvertent authority on the matter, and was telling the story from the beginning with the careful detail of someone who understood that she was part of something that would be spoken of for years. And near the churchyard gate, a stout woman in a gray housekeeper's dress and a white cap stood with her back to the conversation and her hands folded and her brown eyes looking at the closed church door, and she was weeping in a quiet, steady way that had nothing of drama about it and everything of long relief. Mrs. Good had been in the Ashmore household for 20 years. She had dressed Cecily's hair the morning of her first wedding, and she had sat with Edmund in the library the night the word came from Scotland, and she had said nothing, in all the years between, about what she had thought she saw in Bath the previous spring. A slight young woman in a green gown, with a familiar quality of stillness. Because she had not been certain. And she was not a woman who spoke without certainty. She had been watching the door. She had been watching it, without exactly knowing she was watching it. For 4 years. She did not know what was happening inside the church. She was quite certain that what was happening inside the church was the proper resolution of an improper situation, and she allowed herself to weep about it without apology. The vicar of St. Giles, who had stepped outside to speak with the guests and had passed close to her, paused. "Are you well, Mrs. Good?" "Perfectly," she said. That is the grief woman they were talking about. That is the first Duchess of Ashmore. She has come back from the dead. She paused. I am of the opinion that she is owed a fair amount of weeping. The vicar had no answer for this, and after a moment he walked on. What had happened? In the church, in the vestry, in the small private office beside it where Edmund and Cecily spent the better part of an hour with Mr. Prentice and the Duke's own solicitor, who had been among the guests and was now performing the most unusual hour of his professional life, was not a scene of high drama. It was the careful, deliberate work of two people beginning to account to each other for a very long absence, in the formal register of people who are not yet free to be informal, with a table between them and a great many pieces of paper and the sound of the displaced guests' carriages departing in the lane outside. The legal situation was as Mr. Prentice had described it. The Duke of Ashmore had never technically completed the proceedings to have his wife declared dead. The declaration required 7 years, and the petition had been submitted in 1815, with 2 years remaining. The current marriage had not, therefore, taken place. Lady Honoria had been quietly escorted to her father's carriage by a cousin, and the Viscount Pemberton, who was a man of sense, had understood the situation before it was fully explained to him, and had said only that he wished the Duke well, and that he would expect to hear from the Duke's solicitor in due course. The Dowager Duchess had not been escorted to any carriage. She had remained in the churchyard, upright in black silk, until the last guest departed, and then she had spoken to Edmund's steward, who spoke to the Duke, and Edmund had come out to the churchyard and stood with his mother among the old yews and the September light, and they had spoken quietly for some time. What was said between them was between them. He came back inside with his face composed and his jaw set, and he said nothing about it, and Cecily did not ask. By midday they were at Ashmore Hall. She had not been inside that house for 5 years. The drive was the same, the oaks the same, the gray stone of the house catching the September light and holding it in the way of old stone that has absorbed many years of English weather. The roses on the south wall were still there, later in the year than she had ever seen them, deep red against the gray. She sat in the carriage and looked at them through the window, and said nothing, because there was nothing that wanted saying. And Edmund sat across from her, and also said nothing, which had always been one of the things she most appreciated about him. Mrs. Good was at the door before the carriage had stopped. She came down the steps in her gray dress and her white cap, faster than a woman of her age had any business moving, and she took Cecily's hands when she stepped out, and she held them, and she looked at her face for a long time, and then she said, "I thought I saw you in Bath. Last April." "You did," Cecily said. "I told myself I was mistaken. You were not mistaken." Mrs. Good pressed her hands once, firmly, and then released them. She was very composed. Her eyes were entirely dry now. Whatever weeping she had done outside the church dispensed with and done. "The library fire has been laid since this morning," she said. "I will bring tea." There were things that wanted doing, and they did them. There were letters to write to London, to the Hartwell cousin in Bath, to Alice Dare and Fiona McRae in Perthshire, who deserved to know that the woman they had sheltered through a Highland winter had arrived at something that could plausibly be called home. There were rooms to be opened, a wardrobe that was plainly inadequate and would need to be addressed, a great many conversations yet to be had with the household and with the estate and with the world. None of that happened that evening. That evening there was only the library, which was large and quiet, and smelled of old books and wood smoke, with the September dark coming on outside the tall windows, and the fireplace doing its appointed work, and 2 cups of tea growing cold on the side table, because neither of them was attending to the tea. Edmund was standing at the window with his hands at his sides, looking out at the park. He had been standing there for some time. She was in the chair nearest the fire. "I looked for you," he said. "After the first week. When the initial searching had found nothing, I went north myself. I was in Scotland for a month." "I did not know that," she said. "I went to Loch Rannoch. I spoke with McRae." He was quiet for a moment. "He had a woman with him. At his house. I did not see her clearly." She thought about this. October of 1813. She had been there. She had been inside the house when a carriage arrived and Fiona McRae had gone to speak with the visitors and come back and said only that it was someone asking about the accident and had not told her more, and she had not asked. She had still been fragile then, still assembling the rooms of herself one window at a time. "He did not tell you," she said. "He told me a woman had been found on the road," Edmund said. "He told me she had been taken in and had recovered and had gone south. He said he did not know her name." He stopped. "I do not know if that was true." Cecily thought about Alastair McRae, who was a careful and private man who had sheltered her through a winter and kept her letters secret and never pressed her about what she intended to do or when. She thought it was probably not true. She thought Alastair McRae had made a judgment about what she needed and had kept his own counsel about it. "He is a good man," she said. "Yes," Edmund said. He turned from the window. He came and stood by the fire, not sitting, not at any comfortable proximity to her, but near enough that the firelight fell across his face, and she could see the brown of his eyes and the faint cleft at his chin that she had forgotten, and then remembered, and then forgotten again, over 5 years. "I gave up looking in 1814, he said. "I want you to know that I am ashamed of that. You had no reason to think I was alive. I stopped looking while I still had reason to think you might be," he said. "That is not the same thing." She looked at him. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the September dark had completed itself, and the park was invisible. "You mourned," she said. "Yes." "Then do not be ashamed of it," she said. "I do not ask you to be ashamed of it." He sat down, then. Not in the other chair, but on the ottoman beside it, which put him at a height somewhat below her own, which was not a position he had occupied often in his life. And she thought he had chosen it with some deliberateness. "I did not speak," he said. "Today, in the church. I looked at you for half a minute, and I did not speak. I noticed." "I could not," he said. "I want you to understand that I was not calculating. I was not thinking of Honoria or of my mother or of the guests or of what the legal situation was. I was simply not capable for those seconds of speech. I did not know what language the moment was in." She had understood that. In the church. She had seen it in his face. She had understood it. And it had still been frightening. Because 5 years of preparing to be brave does not change what it feels like to watch the person you have come back for look at you without speaking. "Edmund," she said. "Yes, you called me your wife," she said. "In the nave, you said, 'Leave me with my wife.' Yes." "That was enough," she said. "That was sufficient." He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight was warm on his face, on the auburn of his hair, on the particular composed severity of his expression that she had spent 2 years learning and 5 years carrying around with her through Scotland and Bath and the General's study and every other room she had occupied in the interval. "Is it?" he said. "Sufficient?" She thought about the carriage in October and the long winter in a crofter's house and the letters that were turned back and the newspaper in Bath in August, and the drive from Bath to Windley with Mr. Prentice's composed professional face across from her, and the marriage lines in her traveling case. She thought about the September morning and the use and the weeping she had not intended, and the weight of 200 people's attention in a stone nave, and his voice saying her name in the empty church. "It is a beginning," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the precursor of one. The change in the muscles around his eyes that meant the architecture of his composure was choosing, for once, not to entirely hold. He reached into his breast pocket. His hand came out holding something small, small enough to close in his fist, and he held his fist out to her. Closed, and waited. She opened his hand. The brooch was deep red, the color of a winter apple, the garnet set in gold filigree that her mother had bought in Edinburgh the year she was married. Cecily had worn it on her wedding day. She had taken it north with her. It had been in her traveling case. She had not thought to wonder what had become of it. "The case was recovered," Edmund said very quietly. 3 months after the accident. From the ravine. Mostly destroyed. This was in it. She looked at the brooch. She looked at his face. "Your mother told me it was lost," she said. "Yes," he said. "She told me the same." She picked up the brooch from his palm. It was lighter than she remembered, or perhaps she was heavier. The difference between a 19-year-old girl receiving her mother's brooch and a 24-year-old woman who had carried heavier things than this through a long series of winters. She turned it over in her gloved fingers and felt the familiar warmth of the gold. "I should like," she said carefully, "to not have that particular conversation about your mother tonight." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She closed her fingers around the brooch. The fire settled in the grate. Somewhere in the house, a clock was striking the hour, and the sound of it moved through the old rooms of Ashmore Hall, the way sound moves through rooms that have held many years of living, absorbed and gentled, and returned at some slight remove from the sharp thing it had been. She had come back not to claim anything, or not only that. She had come back because 5 years was long enough to be somewhere else. And because the legal truth was the legal truth, and someone had to be the one to say it plainly. And because she was, after everything, still herself, still the woman who had worn this brooch on a winter wedding morning, and driven away in a carriage through London and out into the particular recklessness of October weather. She was still here. That was the thing she had not known during the worst of the Scottish winters, whether she would be able to say when she came out the other side. She was still here. "I intend," she said, "to write to the McRaes this week." "We will write to them," Edmund said. She looked at him. "If that is acceptable to you," he said. The slight formality of it, the old Regency habit of asking permission for what he had already decided, made something ease in her chest, some last guarded thing that had been holding all day. "It is," she said. The clock finished its striking. The fire had settled to red coals, and the room was warm and quiet. And outside the long windows of Ashmore Hall, the English dark held the park, and the oaks, and the late roses on the south wall. And everything was exactly as it had been, and entirely different from what it had been, which is the condition of all rooms that have had the good sense to wait. She was still holding the brooch when she finally, at some late hour, closed her eyes. If you stayed with Cecily through all of it, through the Highland winter, and the returned letters, and the wedding morning and the empty church, I hope you will take a moment and leave a thought below. She would have borne it all without anyone watching. It matters that you watched. The brooch was on the mantelpiece by morning. She had set it there the night before, as she was leaving, and in the morning it caught the first light from the east window, and threw a small piece of red onto the wall above the hearth. And it was there when Mrs. Good came in to lay the fire, and Mrs. Good looked at it for a long time and said nothing, because nothing was required. It was autumn now in Wiltshire. It would be winter soon enough. There was a great deal left to do.